Today we're going to talk about Aquinas' arguments on sex and fornication and sins against nature, which include things like any kind of sex that can't produce children, and homosexuality, bestiality, those sorts of things. I call this, title this talk, Aquinas' arguments on autonomy and sex, although autonomy isn't a word that Aquinas uses, because he does center this conversation about sex not where you would think of it. He centers it in a broader discussion about our ability to control ourselves. Autonomy means that you give a nomos, a rule to yourself. It's self-rule. This is what the virtue called temperance, the ability to control yourself against the desires that you have, is centered on. But I think if Aquinas were speaking today, he would say the appropriate place to consider questions about sex is in relationship to autonomy. That's the way he would put it today. And today we talk a lot about autonomy. The world today, its culture, is very focused on these ideas. We have spent a lot of time trying to center the rights of the individual to make decisions against the power of the government. So we talk about individual autonomy a lot in relationship to resisting political authority. Or we talk about it a little less, but on the left politically there's a little more talk about avoiding economic coercion. And Aquinas shares these concerns. We aren't reading it this semester, but Aquinas has a lot to say about the dangers of government tyranny, the right to resist tyrannical governments. Just last week we saw him talking about the problems of economic coercion as a threat to people in the case of usury. Aquinas shares our concerns about human autonomy, but there's this difference. Aquinas has a much more complete view of human life that begins not with the political or the economic, but begins with man's ability to control himself in relationship to his own nature. That is to say, Aquinas thinks because of the fall, man's nature is in a kind of civil war. There's a conflict. There's a struggle between two principles. And naturally, he thinks, if you look at yourself, you are made, and if you know God has made you for this, you are made so that your higher faculties, your reason, your spirit, your soul, govern the lower faculties. What are the lower faculties? The lower faculties are things like hunger. I get hungry, and I find myself wanting to eat. I get thirsty. I find myself wanting to drink. And Aquinas thinks the most powerful of all of these lower desires it drives is the desire for sex. He thinks it is a very, very, very powerful desire, and it has the leading advantage over all those other things in terms of corrupting the higher faculty, reason, our ability to will what is clearly good. He thinks that sexual passions tend to corrupt man's reason. So there are lots of lower faculties, but the most powerful of them is lust. He thinks of it very much the way we think of, I think all of us think today, about drugs, like heroin. Like if you know people who are addicted, I hope you don't know anyone in this terrible condition, but if you've read about people who are addicted to drugs, like opiates in particular, they do crazy stuff. They do stuff which is clearly horrible, unnatural. They kill, they degrade themselves because they just want the feeling of pleasure they get from the drug. Their whole life is destroyed, and they destroy their bodies, they destroy all their relationships, they do everything bad so they can get their pleasure from the drug. And Aquinas thinks sex is like that. And if you want to judge that, make a sense of that judgment, my advice would be to read literature where the effects of sexual desire are depicted that way clearly. All throughout human literature, the problem of human sexuality is portrayed in this way. But most especially, you can turn to the scriptures, which portray the problems of sexual desire in the most extreme terms. The two greatest kings of Israel, Solomon and David, were both afflicted in their prime, in the prime of their maturity, by sexual lust. And both of them were nearly, or were destroyed by this problem. Okay, next slide. So, Aquinas is going to talk about sex within the context of autonomy. That is to say, he thinks that our fleshly desires pose a problem to our ability to control ourselves. And in your reading, I quoted for you from Romans 7, where Paul is talking about this war he finds in himself. He wants to do one thing, but his desires take him to do another thing. He does what he doesn't want to do. And what he wants to do, he doesn't do. I'm also going to add to it this quote from Galatians 5, which I think gives you a good sense of the war that the fall has caused in man. You, my brothers and sisters, were called to be free, or we might say autonomous. That is to say, free from outside control. And so I say, walk by the Spirit. And then you will not gratify the desires of the flesh. So there's an opposition. You can either be free and walk by the Spirit, or you can be not free and gratify the desires of the flesh. You see the opposition there? For the flesh desires what is contrary to the Spirit. There's a war going on. And the Spirit, what is contrary to the flesh. They are in conflict with each other, so that you do not do whatever you want. And the acts of the flesh are obvious: sexual immorality, impurity, debauchery. Debauchery is a word that Aquinas uses in this reading. To be debauched is to lose a critical faculty. It is to be destroyed in some way. People who are addicted to drugs are debauched. They are incapable of doing things which are obviously good for them, that they want to do, like eating enough, like not betraying their family and friends, like not committing murder to get another fix of a drug, like not selling themselves in prostitution to get another fix of a drug. They are debauched. Their desire for pleasure has destroyed them. But the fruit of the Spirit is very, very different. It's love, joy, peace, forbearance, kindness, goodness, faithfulness, gentleness, and interesting concluding word, self-control. This is exactly what Aquinas thinks. It's passages, many, many passages like this in the Scriptures, which lead Aquinas to say, look, when man was perfect in the garden before sin, his faculties were in harmony with one another. Adam desired Eve, but he desired her in a way that was rational, in which his leading faculties had control. Man now has the possibility of that being inverted, and what is low taking over. And Aquinas is very concerned about outside threats to autonomy. He thinks usury tends to enslave the poor, as Proverbs says. The borrower is the slave to the lender, in Proverbs. He's worried about that. He's worried about the problems of rulers, just like we are today. But Aquinas thinks, quite rightly, I believe, as we all know, that it does you no good to be free under a government. It does you no good to not have economic coercion if you are a drug addict, if you are debauched, if you have no power of self-control. And the difference is, the sexual desire is with us all the time. The desire for pleasure, sexual or otherwise, is with us all the time. It is born into us. And this is why he thinks it's more critical for us to focus on the problems of debauchery. That is to say, people who lose the proper guidance of themselves through their reason, through their soul, and give in to the lower forms. because it constantly threatens us. David, great man, heroic warrior, endured so much hardship, did so many great things, and then in a season of triumph, he was overthrown and debauched. He lost total control of himself and committed adultery and committed murder because of his sexual desire. How could that man, so disciplined, so mighty, how could he murder his most loyal soldier? The soldier who fought for him from another country, how could he murder him? Because his thinking was completely turned around by sexual desire for Bathsheba. Okay? You get what I'm talking about? This is really important. This is exactly how Aquinas is thinking of it. And he would say to us today, you guys, I love how you're concerned about human autonomy. What is the biggest threat to human autonomy, guys? It is lust. Sexual lust and all other kinds of desires for pleasure are the greatest threat. So we need to work on that before we can master everything else. Next slide, please. Okay, question 1. He asked the question, is lust, which sounds like it's about sex, is it only about sex? Okay, is lust only about sex? A lustful man, as we mean it when we speak of a vice opposed to human excellence, let's say virtue, is one who is destroyed and undermined from human excellence by his desires and pleasures. So when we're talking about lust, a lustful person, what we're talking about is somebody who lacks a virtue of self-control. They lack this capacity for autonomy. They are debauched. They are destroyed in their capacity to guide themselves reasonably and rationally as they would. They can't do what they want to do. Okay, just like the Bible's talking about. You can't do what you want to do because you have allowed pleasure to master you. Sexual desires and sexual pleasures destroy the proper functioning of a man's mind above all other kinds. Today you might say, Aquinas, what about heroin? What about Oxycontin? And Aquinas would say, wow, those are terrible things. You should really ban those. You should get those out of circulation. The difference, Aquinas doesn't address this question. The difference when he talks about debauchery from wine and liquor is he would say, well, the difference is wine is external to you, but sexual desires, the desire for pleasure, is internal to you. It's part of what you are. And so for that reason, he says, therefore, lust is a vice which is the most common destroyer of men. It's universal to us. Whatever other problems you may face externally, you're always going to have this one internally. And so we take it as a sign, a symbol, a leading example of all the kinds of desires for pleasure that debauch us. All the kinds of desires for pleasure that destroy us. So he's saying, no, sexual desire isn't the only kind of lust, but it's an especially important example because of its universality among mankind and because it symbolizes all the rest in what they do so perfectly. Okay, next slide. So let's hop now from the Summa Theologica to the Summa Contra Gentiles. Here Aquinas is again situating the discussion of sex. This is the question before the question, is simple fornication, is fornication sex outside of marriage with no other problems? Is simple fornication wrong? And before that, he addresses this question. Namely, in the way that we're made, do we find a divine law guiding us to be concerned about how we use our bodies? Is there anything in our nature that tells us we should be concerned about how we use our bodies? Or can we just do whatever we want with our bodies? And this is how he reasons. Just as the human mind can be raised to God by corporeal and sensible things, provided one makes right use of them for God's honor, and Aquinas here is thinking about how, as Romans 1 says, there's a sense in which just looking around at creation, you can tell that there's a God. And he has a lot of arguments about how you look at creation and why people are inspired to think of God by creation. So, one thing you can do with your body and your senses of the world is you can be drawn up to God. But he says, on the other hand, if you don't use them rightly, if you abuse them, then it can withdraw the mind from God. So there are two relations to our body and to the world that we can have. The right way draws our mind to God. The wrong way draws our mind away from God. It can place the will in lower things, or it can place the will in higher things. The divine law, he thinks, was given chiefly, he has an argument for this, we're not going to read, so that man might be aiming towards God. And so, clearly, it belongs to the law of God to direct man in his love and use of our bodies and other sensible things. Okay? Makes sense? Excellent. Another argument he offers, he says, we all know, if you know about God, that the mind of man should be subordinate to God. And so, we also can see, if you understand these things rightly, God above, man below. So you can look at ourselves and you can think the mind above and the body below. He thinks it's clear that we are meant to use our mind. If you know anything about your mind is a great way for a human being to direct oneself in the world. The person who thinks through things succeeds in operations. We have a mind that's superior to animals. We do better than animals in all practical tasks. Why? Because we have this mind. And when we direct ourselves according to this mind, we succeed. And when we don't, we fail. It's just obvious. The mind is given to rule the body. The body tells us eat, but the mind tells us how to eat, when to eat, how much to eat. And if we follow the mind, we don't get fat, we get healthy. If we follow the stomach, as I do sometimes, we put on some pounds. Therefore, man should be directed by the divine law in such a way that the lower powers, like sexual desire or hunger, should be subjected to reason. The body should be subject to the soul. And external things should be not the master of us any more than our bodies should be. They should also be subjected to our reason. Okay? You see the structure he's talking about? The danger of sex that he's going to talk about immediately is it's going to upset this order of mind over body because lust is so powerful. Next slide, please. So back to the Summa Theologica. His first question is not, can sex be bad? That's not his first question. His first question is, can it be good? He wants to establish first, before he talks about when sex is bad, he wants to talk about when sex is good. Sin is a human act against the order of reason, he says. Reason orders everything to its proper end. So a rational act, you find a hammer and you use it to hammer a nail. You don't use your hammer to unscrew a screw. Reason orders everything to its proper end. A hammer is for hammering nails. It is not for opening soda bottles. Right? Can you open a bottle with a hammer? You can't. Is that proper? No, it's not. Can you use your hand to break windows? Yes, you can. What would be better to break a window? A rock. Okay? And so too, not just about external things, but the things we know the purpose of very well, like ourselves. Right? We have questions about what is the purpose of our sexual organs. Why do we have sexual organs? What are they for? What is their proper use? So, sin is something against the order of reason. Everything is ordered by reason to its end, and to accomplish its end in a fitting manner, provided this end be good. Okay? So he says, what's the purpose of sex? The purpose of sex is the preservation of the human race through procreation. That's its purpose. As the purpose of eating food is the preservation of the individual's life. And these are very good. It is very good that the human race continue on. It's very, 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 very good, he says. He doesn't say good, he says very good, right? Wiping out a race, genocide, very bad. Wiping out the entire human race, extra super bad. Preserving the human race, extra super good. All right? And so he says, it's obvious, just as eating food can be without sin if it's ordered to its proper end, and if it's done in a proper manner. So sexual acts can be without sin when performed in a due manner, ordered to human procreation. All right? So this is the initial gauntlet that Aquinas throws down is, he says, it's obvious what sex is about. It's obvious. It's for making babies. That's what it's for. And if we approach sex and we engage in sex for these purposes in a due manner, that is to say, as we're going to talk about later, that is to say, sex is for having babies, and when you have a baby, you need to be married because a baby needs to be raised in a family. So if you're married and you have sex, awesome, great. Preserving the human race. Way to go, guys. If you do it in another way, or if you do it to have children, you do it in another way, or if you don't do it to have children, now we're doing something which is departing from the clear purpose of human sexuality. Next slide. So now we're going to talk about Aquinas' account of why it is that lust, that is to say, when man begins to put the desire for pleasure in sex above the rational purpose of sex, what are the effects on human autonomy? This is Aquinas' next move. What are the effects on human autonomy if you develop a habit of regarding the purpose of your life as pleasure? And if you begin to embrace sexual pleasure, you get into the habit where you can't control it. What's the effect? So the question is, whether blindness of mind, thoughtlessness, inconstancy, rashness, self-love, hatred of God, love of the world, and despair over the coming world, the future world, are the consequences of lust. So he's going to talk about 4 problems for the intellect and 4 problems for the will that occur when we become lustful. That is to say, when our desire for pleasure overwhelms our rational faculties, like when a desire for heroin overwhelms your rational faculties. Okay. So the argument. The effect of lust is that the lower appetite for pleasure, for sexual desire, maintains a continual focus on its object, sexual pleasure. You push aside everything else and you allow your lower appetite for sexual pleasure to dominate your thinking. It pushes all other objects aside in a certain sense. Aquinas then says, such a disordered focus distorts all aspects of reason and will, which should focus proportionately more on other things than they do under lust. Lust is the condition where the lower becomes treated like the higher, becomes treated as disproportionately good. Okay? So he says this is going to have, if this happens, this is going to have effect all through all the aspects of reason and will. And so he says, because there are 4 acts of reason, and there are 4 orientations of the will corresponding to the names above, therefore these names properly and well describe the effects of lust. Somebody be a pal and open a window. I'm hot. Maybe it's because I'm standing and talking. You guys are wearing winter jackets and parkas, and I'm sweating. I don't know what to say. Next slide. Thank you. Ah, that feels much better.
It's the air conditioner.
It's the air conditioner? It's going to turn, it'll turn into heat soon. I'll get mine. Okay, so this is what Aquinas says. If I can tell you, and in a previous book of the Summa Theologica, Aquinas has written an account of how human action works. And he thinks there are four mental acts that go before you make a practical decision. These steps in making a decision, he says, are simple understanding, counsel, judgment, and command. These are actions that the human intellect is going to perform. So imagine I'm bored and I think, hey, you know what would make me less bored is going on a trip. I think I should go on a vacation. Okay? That is simple understanding. My mind perceives that a vacation is a good thing. My mind perceives it. There's no preliminary thought. My intellect perceives something as good. That's simple understanding. And then, he says, what the mind does next before action. So the first thing, I see some goal as good. I'd like to go on vacation. The next thing I do is my intellect gives me counsel. Now, the counsel might actually be going and asking somebody, hey, Professor Koo, where did you go on vacation last? Professor Koo says, I went to New Jersey. Lovely New Jersey. Beautiful New Jersey. And I go ask, I say, thanks, Professor Koo. And then I go ask Professor Collier, and he says, I went to Tahiti. He went to Tahiti on vacation, and it was very lovely. And then I think about all the places I know to go on vacation, and I think, I want to go to vacation in Tahiti. I gather information, knowledge about how to fulfill this goal. Where's the best place to go on vacation? Should I take an airplane to Tahiti, or should I take a canoe to Tahiti? I should take an airplane. I'm learning about the means that I can accomplish my goal, the various ways that I can fulfill my goal. Then I have to take another step. There's another separate step of the intellect after I've cataloged all the different ways I could fulfill my goal for a vacation, where I could go, how I could get there. I could take a cruise, I could take an airplane, I could drive a car. Then I make a judgment. I have to make a judgment about which of those means to use. I'll make a judgment about those means. And I think, okay, I'm going to go to Tahiti by plane. That's the best way to do this. I have distinguished among the options, and I've chosen Tahiti by airplane as the best way of fulfilling my goal of taking a satisfying vacation. But still, I'm not ready to act. Now I have to make a final move. I've selected among the goals, and now I have to say to myself, go buy a plane ticket to Tahiti. Go do it. I give my will a command. Will. The right thing to do here is buy a plane ticket to Tahiti. And what Aquinas says is, when you are lustful, each one of these things breaks down. So instead of thinking about going on a vacation when I'm bored, if I'm lustful, I'll think, I should go have sex. That's the only thing I'll consider. If I have a problem, the answer will be seek pleasure, sexual pleasure, some other kind of pleasure. Okay? There are many, many, many goods, but when I am lustful, my mind stops surveying the world for many kinds of goods, and instead my lower self picks its goods. Okay? If I was a heroin addict, the answer would always be heroin. What I want is heroin. The only good I perceive is heroin. Okay? Does that make sense? So he says this is blindness of mind. Lust creates a blindness of mind in the simple understanding. It distorts the simple understanding. So a consequence of lust is blindness of mind. And that's different than another consequence of lust, which is the loss of counsel. So once I decide on a goal, then the next thing my practical intellect should do is go, what are the means to accomplish this goal? But with lust, what I do is I just go immediately for the good thing I want. And he calls this, quite reasonably, rashness. I don't take counsel. If somebody says to the heroin addict, you know, if you're going to do a lot of heroin, maybe you should get a job so you can afford heroin. And the heroin addict says, no, I think I'll just rob you right now and get money. And you go, wait a second, if you rob me, then you'll go to jail and you can't get heroin in jail. Whereas if you get a job, at least you can go out and buy heroin every night. But the heroin addict says, I don't want to get a job and get lots of heroin. I want heroin right now. Okay? And you can't counsel him. And this is what Aquinas says about people who are lustful. If somebody has an object of lust before them, you can't counsel them. They are rash. They make decisions without proper counsel. Now, once you have proper counsel, you have to select among the ends, judgment. And again, people who are filled with lust are terrible at this. We just seek whatever immediate means we can have to that goal. We don't choose among the options carefully, and he calls that thoughtlessness. And finally, command, precept. If you are rightly thinking when you make a judgment intellectually, you are constant in that judgment, meaning you can force your will to obey. The mind forces the will to obey. Reason wins. It overcomes lower powers. And Aquinas quotes from a Latin poet a story about a man who resolves to give up having an affair. And the person who hears this resolution says, that will last until your lover winks at you. As soon as she winks at you, you will give up your rational judgment. All she has to do is crook her finger, and you will give up all of these fine notions. Your judgment is inconstant. The judgment of a lustful person is inconstant. It can always be overturned by lust. Okay? So those are the 4 steps he thinks in every practical judgment you have to make. You have to observe a good. You have to take counsel about the means, the ways to accomplish that good. You have to judge among those means. And then you have to put it into action. And he thinks lustfulness undermines you at every step along the way. And so he wants you to think, what is the effect of being lustful? It is to be blind to other goods. It is to be rash in the way that you select among, the way that you consider means to those. It is to be thoughtless in the way that you choose among those means once you've figured out how to accomplish them. And it is to give up the power to put in rational judgment into effect and to become inconstant. It's bad, 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 bad. Okay? And again, if you're trying to just in a practical one-moment think about drug addicts and the way that they only think about drugs, can't be counseled in any way, make terrible decisions among their available options, and no matter how much they resolve, how much they understand drugs are bad for them, they can't give it up. Aquinas says, yeah, but I'm talking about sex here. This is any kind of overwhelming desire for pleasure has this effect on our minds, and sex is the one that we're born into. It's the natural rebellion within the human person. That's not the only problem with being lustful, he says. There's also problems for the will itself. Next slide, please. The will has 2 consequences. One is a consequence in what the will is aimed at, and the other is in its view of things which are related to that goal. So he says, look, what happens when you become lustful is that essentially you're elevating self-love to the top position. You are thinking about yourself above all else. Lust, inordinate desire for sexual pleasure, causes a man to increase his consideration of himself. His will is oriented to pleasing himself. Who gets left out of that? Aquinas says that the secondary consequence of being lustful mostly is you hate God. Because you're constantly aware that you are made not to give in to your sexual desire, but to order your sexual desire by reason. And so you resent everything and everybody who stands against you fulfilling your goal of having sex. It causes us to hate God. Second, there are the things which are related to accomplishing our goal of self-love, we love. We love the world. Pleasures come from the world. We love it. I love the world if you're lustful, because the world is the source of your number one goal. Sexual pleasure, heroin, whatever. You love the world. And what you hate is the world to come. So lustfulness causes you to love yourself, to hate God, to love this world and its pleasures, and to hate the idea of a world where the pleasures will not be physical, but the pleasures will be beholding God, the glory of God, spiritual pleasures. Okay? So this is bad, right? Aquinas thinks that if you're lustful, what we're describing is a systematic distortion of the way you think and the way you will that makes you dumb, idiotic, self-destructive, and fundamentally oriented to yourself, against God, to this world, and against the coming world in its perfections. Do you believe that? That matches my experience, I think the experience of mankind about the effect of lustful people, more or less exactly. I think Aquinas lays it out brilliantly by mapping this on to his human psychology, his understanding of human decision-making. Next slide, please. Next he asks, well, how many kinds of lustful acts are there? We know what lust is now. How should we break down lust? Sexual lust, he says, has 6 species. It consists generally of a debauchery of the mind, where the desire for sex takes over, and there are 6 forms of it. The vice against nature. This basically is masturbation, bestiality, homosexuality, and any other heterosexual acts that are incapable of resulting in procreation, whether because of an artificial contraceptive or because of the location or position of the activity. The vice against nature, that's all of those things. Simple fornication, incest, seduction, adultery, and rape. So Aquinas says, the species of lust consist of different ways that one seeks pleasure in ways that conflict with right reason as to the object sought by the will in having sex. And he says there are just 2 ways that we can will something in sex that is discordant with reason. Either we pick an irrational goal for sex, and we can do that by choosing a sex act that excludes procreation, because that's the goal. And he says that's what we call the vice against nature. The purpose of sex is to have children. If you choose to have sex in ways that exclude having children, you're doing something contrary to reason. We'll call those the vice against nature, because your body immediately is made to have sex when you have children when you have sex. Or it includes procreation, it's open to having children, but it excludes the proper raising of children. So this is when an unmarried man and woman have sex, they have a child, but they're not married, and so there's no one around to properly care for the child. So the first he calls vices against nature, and the second he calls simple fornication. It's simple because there aren't other complicating aspects, as we find in adultery, where you're not only fornicating, but you're also violating the rights of the other spouse. Seduction, where you're seducing a young woman out from under her parental home, where you're violating the rights of parents or her guardians. Or incest, where you're not only violating you're not only engaged in fornication, but you're also violating the proper respect which is owed to your family members. So, the first thing you can do is you can choose an end in sex which is not connected to having and rearing children. So if you have sex in a way that you can't have children, that's against nature. 2, you can have sex that's open to having children, but not to raising children, and that's simple fornication. What other kinds of species are there? Well, you could seek procreation, but you could have the wrong rational perspective on your partner. So, for example, it could be you have sex with a near relative, incest. Aquinas says we don't have sex with near relations because, as the Bible teaches us, we owe a duty of honor to our families, and having sex with your sister, your near relations, your aunt, your uncle, these sorts of things, they show disrespect to your family, and so they're wrong. Also, you could not pay respect to a person's guardians. If the persons are under their parental authority, then you should not seduce someone into having sexual relations. That is the wrong of seduction. If someone's married, then you're dishonoring the marriage. That's adultery. And finally, if you use violence in any of these things, it intensifies them in a different way because the violence shows fundamental disrespect to the person that you're using violence on. That's rape. Okay? So, how many different kinds of bad acts are there that display an irrational lustfulness? 6, Aquinas says. 2 in the category of not properly seeking children or to raise children, and then 3 in the category of not paying proper respect to the person you're having sex with, incest, seduction, or rape. Okay? So if you're trying to figure out, am I lustful, you should look in one of those categories. Interestingly, from this, you will note that Aquinas does not take homosexuality to be a fundamental species of sexual lustfulness. He certainly includes it, but he thinks it is of a kind with many other acts. Bestiality, masturbation, any kind of heterosexual act that is foreclosing reproduction. So oral sex, anal sex, manual sex, intercrural sex between a man and a woman are on the same level as homosexuality for Aquinas. So this is a very important point. If someone asks you, is it worse to engage in homosexuality or in oral sex, heterosexual sex, Aquinas would say, well, they belong to the same species of wrong. They both reflect a desire for pleasure that is unbalanced to the goal of reproduction. Okay? So this is very serious because I think in basically healthy societies, like Korea is basically healthy, I think, there's very little temptation for most people to homosexuality, but other kinds of sex which close off reproduction, I think, are very tempting, particularly for older, unmarried people, and you should think about Aquinas' arguments. You should think about whether they're right, whether they're wrong, and what they mean. Okay, Aquinas has asked the question, next slide, whether simple fornication is wrong. Is it wrong for a man and a woman to have sex when they're not married, but there's no adultery, there's no seduction, everybody's willing? Is it wrong? And today a lot of people think the answer is no. Simple fornication is not a big deal. And Aquinas, this is back in the Summa Contra Gentiles, he says, we must refute the error of those who assert that there is no sin unless our neighbor is injured or scandalized. this is pretty much the modern position, which is, you know, if people want to have fornication, that's their business. And as long as you don't injure anyone else, it doesn't affect anyone else, you do it privately, who cares, right? I mean, just so you know, as Solomon said, there's nothing new under the sun. And there's nothing I learned this in 8th grade from my classics teacher. We were giggling about something, as boys do. We were like, oh, a girl. We were laughing. And our Latin teacher said something like, you know, boys, there is no sexual deviance, no sexual idea that we have today that the Greeks didn't practice 3,000 years ago and write scientific manuals on. You know, grow up a little bit. The same arguments that we make about sex today have always been made. Aquinas is responding to those. For example, the deniers say, take for instance a woman who is not bound by the marriage tie or under any authority. If a man have intercourse with her consent, she does no wrong. She pleases herself, and, as we would say today, her body is her own. He does not wrong a third party because in supposition she is under no one's authority, therefore there is no sin. And he says, and also people can be scandalized by anything, so as John Stuart Mill would say, you know, forget about scandal. Who cares what the effect of your moral example is on other people? Who cares if you lower the moral tone of society? People are scandalized by lots of things. Ignore scandal and focus on your human autonomy. So here's Aquinas' answer, a different version of the one he gave above. Next slide. Simple fornication is sex between an unmarried man and woman in a manner capable of producing children, which is consensual. This is why we call it simple. It's not rape, and it's not against the interests of a husband, as in adultery, or against the interests of parents, as in seduction. So that's what we mean by simple fornication. Is it a sin? Something is a sin if it tends to injure the life of the children that can be born from sex. And then his conclusion, so simple fornication is a sin because it tends to injure children, because the upbringing of a human child requires a committed support of the wife and child during pregnancy by the husband, support during infancy of the child, the education of the child as they mature, the endowment of the child, that is to say, giving them an inheritance, giving them support to get them going in life, the kind of support arising only from the bond of matrimony between a man and a woman. So one of Aquinas' arguments, very basic argument, is simple fornication is obviously rationally wrong, because if you know anything about human children, which unfortunately today you may not know very much about human children, but human children require lots and lots of care all of their lives. Think about how your parents are still caring for you, if you're lucky enough to have them. If you've been blessed in that way. If you don't have them, think about how much you would like their support and their guidance. And then keep going backwards in time till you were in your mother's womb, and when your mother was heavily pregnant, she needed lots of help. And when you were a little baby, the family needed lots of help. And you particularly needed help when you were an annoying teenager who was filled with back talk and sass, and your parents nevertheless patiently loved you and tried their best to guide you, to keep you from making all the mistakes that you went on to make in any case, ignoring their guidance. That's a little joke, but the results, next slide, the results of simple fornication are incredibly bad. When I was born, for Americans, the rate of out of wedlock childbirth for whites in the United States was 5%, 1970, 5%. By 1990, by the time I graduated from high school, it had exploded threefold to 15%. And recently, in the United States, it was 28% in 2016. I think it's 30-something now. So a third of children are born without a mother or a father in the household. They're born to a single spouse. In some communities in the United States, the rate is much higher. So in Hispanic communities, for example, in the United States, slightly more children are born to single mothers than to a family. In African American communities in the United States, the rate is 72%. So if you are born to a married couple and you're African American in the United States, you are a distinct minority. And in some sections of the African American community in the United States, the rate is even higher. Essentially, everyone is being born out of wedlock. And this is just to point out the effect of scandal. That when you set an example by having children out of wedlock, it spreads. When you introduce a culture that praises sex and doesn't encourage people to think about its relationship to children, you run into big problems. And in the United States, we've had a cultural revolution that says sex, 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 and says nothing about the relationship of sex to children. And lo and behold, when you have sex, you have children. And this is a very big problem. What are the effects of doing this? Next slide, please. There's no end. I mean, Aquinas says it very coolly, but there is no end to the destructiveness that comes from being a child born to a single mother. The proportion of single-parent households in a community predicts its rate of crime and burglary, of violent crime and burglary. But poverty does not. So economists who have studied this have looked and said, you know, there are plenty of poor communities that have very low rates of crime, violent crime, property crime. Where there's a lot of property crime and violent crime, what predicts it is not poverty per se, it's children born without fathers. 72% of juvenile murderers, 60% of rapists come from single mother homes. It's shocking, right? We talk a lot about disparate relations between whites and African Americans in the United States. It's a clear fact, if you sort by one factor, whether you were born to parents or not born to two parents, the crime rate differences disappear between African Americans and whites in the United States. Next slide, please. Children who are raised in households without a mother and father are 5 times more likely to commit suicide, 9 times more likely to drop out of high school, 10 times more likely to become addicts to drugs, 14 times more likely to commit rape, 20 times more likely to end up in prison, 32 times more likely to run away from home. And a recent series of studies that I find it's just so utterly appalling. Children who are in single mother homes are significantly more likely to have premature puberty. That is to say, the girls enter puberty earlier. And this is the result, apparently a chemical hormonal result of having strange men in a household with their mothers, is the girls sexually mature earlier. The body, this isn't a psychological effect, this is a chemical effect. And it reflects the deep ways in which we are made to be matured and raised in a household of a man and woman. So when we make light of simple fornication, when we disrupt people's moral sense, not only that you should have sex, it's related to children, but you should do it in a context where the children can be raised properly, you're doing something that's very socially damaging. Next slide. Okay. Simple fornication aside, Aquinas also introduced another category, the unnatural vice. And he asks the question, is it really a different species of lust than fornication? Should we really think about this as a difference? And he says yes. The various kinds of lust are distinguished by different modes of subordinating reason to sexual desire. Apart from sexual acts that are open to children but wrong because of lack of marriage, incest, seduction, adultery, or rape, some sexual acts, unlike those, are closed to reproduction, and thus contrary to reason for a different reason, namely that the sexual act should be open to reproduction. Therefore, these acts against the nature of the sexual act are distinct forms of lust. Effeminacy, which is his term for masturbation, bestiality, homosexuality, sodomy, and other forms of heterosexual intercourse closed to reproduction. Next slide. So, what's so serious about the unnatural vices? Whether we're talking about homosexuality or masturbation, whether we're talking about bestiality or oral sex, what's so serious about it? Going back to the Summa Contra Gentiles. As it's been stated, God cares for everything in respect of what is good for it. And it's good for everything to obtain its end. And it is evil that anything turn from its intended purpose, the one that God has for it. This applies to the parts as well as to the whole, so that man's every part, even as his every action, should attain its due end. Now, though the seed, he's talking about male sperm, be superfluous for the preservation of the individual, it is necessary for the propagation of the species. Other superfluities of bodies, feces, urine, sweat, are not necessary for anything. Their only purpose is to discharge them, to get them away from the body. Semen, however, has another end in view, since it is emitted for the purpose of having babies, generation, which is the object of intercourse. Moreover, generation would be in vain if due nourishment were not to follow, because the offspring would not survive. Hence, the emission of seed should be ordered in such a way that suitable generation and education of the offspring may follow. Next slide. It is therefore clearly contrary to man's good that the seed be emitted in such a way that generation cannot ensue. And if this be done deliberately, it must be a sin. I mean, if it is done in a way that is directly opposed to generation in the person's intent, such as every emission of seed without the natural union of male and female would be. Hence, sins of this kind are said to be against nature. If, however, it is accidental that generation cannot ensue, it is not on this account contrary to nature or sinful, for example, if your partner is sterile. So, Aquinas draws the line here. I mean, as with all the arguments we've been saying, it's a very short chain of progression. What is sperm for? It's to have babies. If you emit sperm for another reason, it's wrong. It's against nature. Like a hammer is for hitting a nail, that's what human sexuality is about. It's about having babies. So, homosexuality, because it's not open to having babies, is lustful. Bestiality, because you can't have sex with an animal in a way that produces offspring, is lustful. But lots of things that are very popularly glamorized today, oral sex, anal sex, manual sex, masturbation, which we're encouraged to practice by the culture, are just like homosexuality and bestiality against that nature. Now there are arguments to be had on this point, but I just want to confront you with the simple, basic argument. Aquinas has got to be right in some sense. Sex is about having babies. Okay? So if overall your approach to sex has nothing to do with babies, and it's all about having pleasure, and you're willing to engage in things which are pleasurable to you, but have nothing to do with getting married and having babies, he's got to be right at some level there. If your overall attitude in this way is shaped that way, then there's a big problem. Next slide. How big a problem is it? He says, well, the emission of seed without the requisite intention of procreation and education must not be thought a slight sin, a small sin, or none at all, to use some part of the body for a purpose for which nature intended it. For instance, if one walks on one's hands, he says, well, somebody might say, well, if I walk on my hands, it's not a big sin, even though my hands are not intended to be walked on. Okay. What if I use my feet to play the guitar? Is that a sin? Okay, let's consider whether it's an unnatural use, like using your feet to play the guitar or walking on your hands. He says, by such actions, man's good is not prejudiced very much. But if somebody insisted on walking on their hands all the time, and never using their hands to open jars, but only using their feet, I mean, just nobody does that. But there are lots of people, because of the power of sex, who use sex to get pleasure all the time, and only to get pleasure. By such actions, man's good is not prejudiced very much. But the irrational, inordinate discharge of semen is perversive of a natural good, which is super important, namely the preservation of the species. Therefore, after the sin of murder, whereby human nature is deprived of natural existence, this kind of sin, whereby generation of human nature is hindered, seems to hold the second place. So he goes, look, murder, super bad. You're actually annihilating human existence, but lustful acts which threaten the course by which human existence is preserved as a race come in number two. Super serious. And when I was young and having these arguments about homosexuality and different kinds of sex, we would say things like, if people adopt your ideas about the purpose of sex, that sex is, you can just seek your own pleasure in it, and as long as you are satisfied with your sexual life, it's got to be good. If people were to believe this, there would be horrible consequences for the human race. If people just sought pleasure in sex and didn't view it as a duty to have children in their sexual relations, there would be a huge problem, because people might quite rationally go, well, I'll take the pleasurable part and I'll ditch the 30 years of supporting a child part. I'll take the fun in bed part and I will forget about the changing diapers, teaching to read, disciplining, educating, supporting part. And of course, in my time, everybody said, no, that's not going to happen. But if you look around the world today, people are not having babies. They're having sex. They're watching pornography. They're masturbating. They're engaging in lots of homosexuality. They are engaging in lots of sex with contraception that keeps children from arising. But we have a big problem. In the United States, in Korea, in Europe, in many, many parts of the world, people aren't having enough babies. And if you say to them, as sometimes governments do, why don't you have more babies? The people say, well, why? There's nothing wrong with having sex without having babies. In fact, Aquinas is very clear. He thinks simple fornication it's bad, but it's much better than having sex, oral sex, or anal sex heterosexually. Because at least simple fornication, babies happen. At least the human race is preserved in some form. It's very bad for children, but at least you're not so anti-human that you don't have babies. But if you have sex with no babies, you're doing something monstrous. It's against nature. And folks, that's where we are. the world was so wise that it convinced everybody that it was fine to do this. It was fine to teach people that sex is not about children, sex is about pleasure. We listened to people who told us that we were too hung up about sexual self-control, and so now everybody's watching pornography, having sex with contraceptives, doing everything except having babies, and it's a global catastrophe. Second to last slide, we're almost done. Aquinas thinks these kind of sexual relations, homosexuality, bestiality, sex with contraceptives, oral sex, anal sex of heterosexuals, is the worst kind of sexual sin. Why? In every genus, the worst of all is the corruption of the principle on which the rest depend. So he says in science, if you screw up logic, if you teach people bad logic, you make the worst kind of error in science, because everything else depends on it. If you teach people bad math, you make the worst kind of error. And he says, with respect to sex, if you convince people, or if a person becomes convinced that sex is about pleasure, not having children, then all the other structure of marriage, of restraint in sex, it all goes flying away. It's the worst kind of thing because through scandal, it encourages people to adopt an attitude towards sex which is wholly destructive and wholly encouraging of lust. Last slide. Just as the ordering of right reason proceeds from man, so the order of nature is for God himself. Wherefore, in sins contrary to nature, whereby the very order of nature is violated, an injury is done to God, the author of nature. And so Aquinas is saying, look, I think sex is about having children. And I think it's clear, if you believe in God, if you look at your body, it's clear that's what it's about. You think it's about something more complicated? Fine. But be clear in your own mind. Aquinas thinks, therefore, whatever you think sex is about, if you thwart it, this is a very serious problem, because in your conscience you know God made you to do one thing, and you're doing something else. If you're engaged in homosexuality, God made boys for girls and girls for boys, not boys for boys and girls for girls. God made man for man, not man for animals, bestial. God made your sexual organs for copulation with another person, not masturbation. If you do these things, he thinks, you know in your conscience you are offending against the natural order that was made by God. Now, I find these arguments powerful. I think this is a very short presentation Aquinas makes. There's lots more to say. There's lots of complicated arguments and counter-arguments that can be raised. But at the base level, come on, sex is about having children, guys. This is my favorite argument to make to judges. Come on, judge. When you run out of other arguments, you just go, come on. It's an appeal to the general absurdity of life. Come on, judge. If you don't think sex is about having children, you know, as President Biden would say, come on, man. It's about having children, folks. Search your conscience. It is. That doesn't solve every problem, but we live in an age which is lustful and has clearly driven a separation between having children and sex, and this is a huge error, and it's a sign we're lustful, and it's a sign we allow lower powers to dominate our higher powers, and all of us, King David, King Solomon, you, me, we're all vulnerable, always, to the power of lust, and especially in a society like ours, that has lost its way, we should be especially careful. Will these arguments save the day? Should we start making posters out of my PowerPoints and putting them up? When you see a young couple on campus and they're getting too kissy, when I walk by and people are sitting on a park bench and they're getting real close to each other, I walk with heavy feet so that they stop whatever they're doing. Should I make a little card out that says, you know, don't subordinate your higher faculties to your lower faculties? No, that will not work. But it is very useful for you to be able to understand and articulate these things. The fact is, as we read in Romans 1, the growth of lust in a society is a result of idolatry. It's a result of abandoning God. As we saw in the first slide, there is a continual war between the spirit and the flesh. When man becomes idolatrous, this is what we read in Romans 1. Therefore God gave them up in the lusts of their hearts to impurity, to the dishonoring of their bodies among themselves, because they had exchanged the truth about God for a lie, and worshipped and served the creature rather than the Creator, who is blessed forever. Amen. Lust is a punishment. We are in the midst of a judgment. This is not the result of bad argumentation. This is a punishment for idolatry. For this reason, God gave them up to dishonorable passions. Their women exchanged natural relations for unnatural, and the men likewise gave up natural relations with women and were consumed with passion for one another. Men committing shameless acts with men and receiving in their own persons the due penalty for their error. The growth of homosexuality, the growth of masturbation, bestiality, sins against nature is a punishment from God. People who do this are bearing the wrath of God. God has given us up to the debased tendencies of our heart, because the only antidote to lust is the Spirit. Arguments do not conquer lust. Remember, the effect of lust is to remove counsel. It's to remove judgment. You can't counsel drug addicts out of drug addiction. You can't counsel the lustful out of lustfulness. Okay? You can beat them in an argument. You ever beaten a heroin addict in an argument? It's not satisfying. You can beat them in an argument, that's good. It's good to have reasons. But the only way to respond to lust in your own life is with spiritual renewal. The only way to respond to lust in society is with a great ministry of the truth of Jesus Christ in society. Let's pray together. Father in heaven, we thank you for helping us to consider these important matters. Please, Lord, save us from lust. Renew us with your Holy Spirit. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen.